My password didn't work on the first try. It didn't work on the second or the third either, and I sat there in my own back office on a Sunday afternoon realizing I didn't know the login to my own company's accounting software because I had never needed to. 8 years. That's how long I'd been walking past that part of the business without looking at it, because Ray looked at it, and Ray handled it, and that was the arrangement we'd built, and neither of us had ever suggested changing it. I reset the password, got in, and clicked on the monthly vendor report because that seemed like the most straightforward place to start. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I told myself I was just getting familiar with the numbers, just doing the kind of thing a business owner should probably do occasionally. I was already rewriting the reason I was there before I'd even seen anything. The first thing I saw was a recurring payment to a company I didn't recognize. 4 figures a month. Every month. I scrolled back, and it kept going further than the screen would show without loading another page, and then another. I loaded them. I kept scrolling. The payments went back further than I was prepared for, steady and regular as a utility bill, paid out to a vendor name I had never once heard Ray mention in 8 years of Monday morning catch-ups and quarterly reviews and handshake deals closed over lunch. 8 years of trust. And I was only now looking at the books. We built the shop with about $12,000 between us, and a lease on a building that smelled like motor oil and old carpet. That was 8 years ago. Now we had 11 people on the floor, a client list that kept a waiting schedule, and a reputation in the region that we'd earned slowly and hadn't had to defend yet. I ran the floor. I managed the crew, handled the client relationships, made sure the work going out the door was worth what we were charging for it. Ray handled everything with a dollar sign attached. Invoicing, vendor accounts, payroll, the quarterly reviews with the accountant. We'd agreed to that split in a parking lot the week before we signed the lease, and neither of us had ever suggested revisiting it. It worked because we were different in the right ways. I was better on the floor, and Ray was better in a restaurant booth with a client who needed to feel taken care of. He had a way of making people trust him quickly, a warmth that felt immediate and specific, like you were the only person he was glad to see. It had closed deals I couldn't have closed. I told him that directly, more than once, and he'd always deflected it the way he deflected most compliments, with a grin and a subject change. Linda had been doing the books part-time for about 3 years. Ray had brought her in when the volume got to be more than the software alone could manage. She was quiet and professional and thorough, and in 3 years she had never once come to me with a question she could have taken to Ray instead. She kept her head down and did the work, and that was all I'd ever needed her to do. She left me a voicemail on a Friday afternoon. I was still on the floor when it came in, and I didn't listen to it until I was in my truck. Her voice was measured, the way it always was, but there was something careful in it that I noticed. She was giving 2 weeks' notice. Standard enough. But she said she'd like to speak to me directly before she left. Not Ray. Me. I called her back from the parking lot. She thanked me for returning the call quickly and said she wanted to handle the transition professionally and make sure everything was in order before she left. I told her I appreciated that and asked if there was anything specific she needed from me. She said there was one thing. Have you personally reviewed the vendor list in the last year? She said. I told her no, that Ray handled the vendor accounts. The pause that followed was long enough that I checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. I'd suggest taking a look yourself, she said. Before I go, if possible. I asked her what I was looking for. I think it would be better if you looked first, she said. I don't want to characterize anything before you've seen it. She said it carefully, the way someone says something they've been deciding how to say for a while. I told her I'd look at the books over the weekend. She said it sounded like a good idea and thanked me again, and we got off the call. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes after that. Then I drove home and tried to think about something else, and mostly failed. Ray and I met on a job site when we were both in our late 20s, working for a contractor who paid late and yelled early. We were the 2 people on that crew who talked about doing it differently, and eventually we stopped talking about it and did it. 1 truck, 2 welders, a client Ray had charmed at a trade show, and a lease on a building neither of us could really afford yet. That was the beginning. Ray was the one who pushed to incorporate. He researched the structure, found the accountant, set up the business banking, got the software running. I remember sitting across from him at a folding table in the empty shop, signing the documents he'd laid out, and thinking that this was exactly why the partnership made sense. He handled the things I had no patience for. I kept the operation running and the work quality high, and that was the deal we'd made, and it had felt like an equal trade for a long time. I signed whatever Ray put in front of me. That's not an indictment, or it didn't feel like one at the time. It felt like trust and efficiency and playing to your strengths. He'd explain the broad shape of whatever we were signing, and I'd ask a question or two, and then I'd sign it. 8 years of that. Quarterly reviews I didn't attend. Tax seasons Ray described as fine. Annual distributions that came in a little lower than I calculated, but Ray always had a reason, and the reason always made sense in the moment. The mail went to Ray. I don't know exactly when that became the default, but it had been the default for years. Vendor correspondence, bank statements, anything with a return address that looked official. He'd bring things to me when he needed my signature and handle the rest himself. When tax season arrived, he'd meet with the accountant alone and come back with a summary and a number. I'd ask if everything looked clean, and he'd say, "Don't worry about it." And I'd move on because I had 11 people to manage and a floor to run, and Ray had the other half covered. My distribution had been smaller than expected 3 years running. Ray's explanation was always some version of the same thing. Equipment costs, the software upgrade, the slow quarter in winter. The explanations were plausible and detailed, and I had no framework to push back against them with. So I didn't push back. My wife, Carol, put her fork down when I told her what Linda had said. She didn't raise her voice. She had a way of being most direct when she was most still. "When are you going to look at the books?" she said. I told her I was planning to that weekend. "I've been asking you to do that for 2 years, she said. "Not because I thought something was wrong, just because you should know what's in there. It's the thing that feeds this family, and you've never once looked at it." I told her Ray handled that side. "I know Ray handles it," she said. "That's what I'm talking about." She picked her fork back up and didn't say anything else about it, which was somehow harder to sit within if she'd pushed further. She'd been patient about this for a long time, and the patience had run out quietly, the way it does when someone has made their point enough times that making it again feels like a waste of breath. I thought about the voicemail on the drive to the shop that Sunday. I thought about Carol putting her fork down. I thought about 8 years of distributions that came in light and explanations that satisfied me because I wanted to be satisfied. Then I reset my password and got into the books. I kept it casual. That was deliberate. I'd spent Sunday night deciding that the worst thing I could do was walk in Monday morning with my jaw set and my questions lined up, because if I was wrong about any of it, I'd have poisoned 8 years over a bookkeeper's careful pause on a phone call. So I waited until we were both in the office with coffee, and I brought it up like it had just occurred to me. I told Ray I wanted to start pulling my own project cost reports, get a better handle on the margin side of things. He looked up from his phone and grinned. "Yeah, absolutely," he said. "I've been meaning to get you in there anyway." Then he spent the next 10 minutes explaining why now wasn't the best time. The software was a mess, he said. They'd been doing a data migration in stages, and half the historical records were in a transitional format that didn't display cleanly. He was already in conversations with a new platform vendor, and they were looking at a full migration next quarter, and once that was done, everything would be cleaner and easier to read. It would make more sense to wait and start fresh on the new system rather than learn the current one right before it changed. I listened and nodded and didn't argue. "Tell you what," he said, "let's grab a beer Friday. I'll walk you through everything properly. Sit down together. I'll show you how I read the reports, explain the vendor structure. Better than you poking around in there alone, try to make sense of it." I said Friday worked. That afternoon, he sent me a login. I took that as a good sign, that he'd followed through same day, that maybe I was reading too much into things. I opened the software and logged in and spent about 2 minutes realizing what I was actually looking at. A summary dashboard, revenue totals, payroll summary, a simplified expense category breakdown. Clean and readable, and almost entirely useless. No vendor ledger, no line item detail, no way to see who was being paid or how much or how often. I messaged Ray and asked about the full vendor access. He replied inside a minute. Said that was all he got too, that the software had tiered permissions built in and the detailed ledger was only accessible from the admin account, which was linked to the accountant's login for audit purposes. He said it was a software limitation, not something he'd set up, and he'd ask about getting it changed when they did the migration. I read the message twice. Then I put the phone face down on my desk and looked at the wall for a moment. Ray had been living inside those books for 8 years. He knew every vendor, every line item, every payment schedule. And he was telling me with a straight face that he didn't have access to the detailed ledger either. I said nothing. I told him Friday sounded good. And I called a forensic accountant before lunch. Linda lived 20 minutes from the shop in a small house with a porch light on. She'd agreed to see me when I called that afternoon. No hesitation, which told me she'd been waiting for me to ask. She let me in, poured coffee without asking if I wanted any, and set a manila folder on the table between us before she sat down. I prepared this before my last day, she said. I wasn't sure you'd come. The folder had printouts going back 2 years. Vendor payments she'd flagged internally, annotated in her careful handwriting, with dates and amounts and the names of the companies she questioned. She'd raised it with Ray twice. The first time he told her it was a consulting arrangement that predated her involvement, and she didn't need to understand the details. The second time he was less patient about it. He told me to process the payments and focus on what I was hired to do, she said. I processed them, but I kept copies. I asked her why she hadn't come to me sooner. She looked at her coffee cup. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, she said. And Ray was the one who hired me. I kept thinking I was missing something, that there was an explanation I didn't have access to. But when I decided to leave, I thought someone should have this. I thanked her and took the folder home. Carol was still up when I got in. I sat at the kitchen table and started running the vendor names through basic public record searches while she read nearby. 2 of the companies had no website, no listed phone number. The addresses on file were residential. I was looking at the second address, trying to place the street name, when Carol walked past and glanced at the screen. She stopped. That's Ray's mother-in-law's street, she said. I'm almost certain. We drove past her place after their 4th of July thing 2 summers ago. I looked at the address again. Carol pulled up a map on her phone and held it next to the screen, and we both looked at it without saying anything. I drove back to the office that night. I logged into the accounting software with a password I'd reset on Sunday, got into the full vendor ledger this time, and started scrolling back. The recurring payment was there, steady and unchanged, every month without exception. I went back further than I had on Sunday, loading page after page, and then I found where it started. 6 years ago. Not 8. Not from the beginning of the partnership, but from 2 years in, which meant there had been a period when things were straight, or appeared to be, and then something changed, and the payments began and ran every month for 6 years without interruption and without me ever once asking a question about them. I sat in the empty office and looked at the screen. The floor was dark and quiet around me, and I could hear the ventilation system running and nothing else. 6 years of payments to companies with no websites and residential addresses and names I had never heard Ray mention once in 8 years of partnership. And if those were in there, visible once I finally looked, I had no way of knowing yet what else was buried underneath them. Carol had found the accountant through someone at her firm. A referral passed quietly through a friend who understood discretion. His name was Garrett, and he worked out of a plain office above a title company, and he had the manner of someone who had seen most variations of this particular kind of problem before. I brought everything. Linda's folder, my own printouts from the vendor ledger, 3 years of tax returns I'd pulled from the filing cabinet at home the night before. Garrett spent 3 hours with the files while I sat in the waiting area and drank bad coffee and checked my phone without reading anything on it. When he called me back in, he set the documents in a neat stack to one side and folded his hands on the desk. For suspected shell vendors, he said, possibly more pending a deeper pull. Commingled personal and business expenses running through at least two of the vendor accounts, structured in small enough increments to stay below the thresholds that would flag automatically, and a pattern of adjusting journal entries near the end of each quarter that brought the totals back into normal range. Whoever had done it understood the software and understood what an inattentive review would and wouldn't catch. I asked him for a dollar estimate. He gave me a range. The bottom of it was bad. The top of it was worse. I sat with that for a moment and then asked him how I should proceed. He looked at me steadily. "That's the part one need you to hear carefully," he said. "You're a 50% owner and you signed every annual tax return for 8 years. You signed them without reviewing the underlying records, which means your exposure isn't zero. If this goes to an audit or a legal proceeding before you've positioned yourself correctly, you're not just the victim in the room. You could be a liable party." I asked him what that meant practically. "It means you don't confront him," Garrett said. "You don't tip him off, you don't move money, you don't change access permissions, and you don't tell anyone who might tell him. You get an attorney who handles commercial fraud before Ray hears a single word of this. If you go in angry and uncoordinated, you will hand him time to move things around, and you could lose the company you're trying to protect." I thanked him and drove back to the shop. I didn't go inside. I parked across the lot and sat in the truck and watched the building. About 20 minutes later, Ray came out the side door, still on a phone call, laughing at something. He tossed his keys once in the air and caught them and got in his car. I looked at the car. I knew what car it was. I'd seen it 100 times, but I was looking at it differently now. It was a newer model than mine by 2 years. I'd assumed he'd financed it or gotten a deal somewhere, or that his wife's income had covered the gap. I'd assumed something and moved on because that was what I did. I watched him pull out of the lot still laughing, and I sat there in the dark running the numbers on what Garrett had told me and trying to figure out how to save something that someone I trusted had been quietly hollowing out for 6 years. The attorney's name was Susan Park, and she came recommended by Garrett with a single sentence: "She handles these cleanly." Her office was downtown, and she wore the expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people did to each other in business partnerships. I liked her immediately. She told me what I needed, and I spent the next 2 weeks getting it. I pulled bank statements through my own online portal, going back as far as the access allowed. I photographed vendor invoices I found in the shop office files, the physical copies Ray kept in a labeled drawer I had never once opened in 8 years. I called Linda and asked if she'd be willing to put in writing what she'd told me at her kitchen table. She said yes without hesitation, and the signed statement arrived by email 2 days later, detailed and precise. Exactly the kind of document that would be hard to argue with in a room where arguing mattered. Carol took a week off work. She didn't ask me if I wanted help. She sat down at the kitchen table one evening with a legal pad and told me what she was going to do. She built the timeline herself, working backward from the current year, cross-referencing Ray's visible spending against the distribution records. Every significant purchase she could document. Every business trip that didn't match a client invoice. Every year, my distribution landed lower than the projection Ray had given me at the start of that fiscal year. On the third day, she called me into the kitchen and pointed at her screen. A duplicate payment, same vendor, same amount, processed 11 days apart in the same month. Garrett had missed it. It wasn't the largest number in the file, but it was clean and clear and unambiguous, and Carol had found it because she'd been looking at everything without assuming any of it was fine. Susan filed to freeze the business accounts on a Thursday morning. The dissolution meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Ray would be served and notified through proper channels and would walk into that meeting knowing the accounts were frozen and that I had counsel and that something had changed, but he wouldn't know yet exactly how much I had. I went to the shop Thursday evening and closed out the day the way I always did. Checked the floor, signed off on the next morning's schedule, made sure the equipment log was updated. Ray was there until about 7. We talked about a client delivery timeline and whether we needed to bring someone in for the following week's load. He was relaxed and easy the way he always was at end of day, keys on the desk, phone in his hand. I said goodnight. He said goodnight. I locked up and drove home and didn't say a word. I'm over at where silence ends. Subscribe if any of this sounds familiar. Ray was 15 minutes late. The narrator, Carol, Garrett, and Susan were already seated when he came through the door, and the first thing he saw was Garrett's face because Garrett was directly in his line of sight. Ray's expression didn't collapse all at once. It just stopped working the way a signal drops, and for a moment he stood in the doorway, holding his jacket and not moving. He sat down. Nobody offered coffee. Garrett opened the folder and started from the beginning. He didn't editorialize. He read line items. The first shell vendor, the registration date, the monthly payment amount, the 6-year total. The second vendor, the residential address, the commingled expense categories. The maiden name LLC, registered 14 months into the shell arrangement, appearing in the ledger under a vendor description so generic it read like a placeholder. The adjusted journal entries, end of quarter, consistent across 5 of the 6 years. The duplicate payment Carol had found. All of it read aloud in Garrett's flat professional voice while Ray stared at the table in front of him. When Garrett finished, Ray looked up. "That's a consulting structure," he said. "It's all documented. There's a service agreement." Susan asked him to produce it. Ray said his attorney would handle that. "Your attorney isn't here," Susan said. He shifted in his chair. "Tom knew about some of this," he said, using the narrator's first name. "We talked about consulting costs. He knew the business had overhead I was managing. He knew the business had expenses," Susan said. "He didn't know who was being paid or why. We both benefited," Ray said. "The business grew. Tom's distribution reflects that." Carol made a sound beside the narrator that wasn't quite a laugh. Susan slid Linda's signed statement across the table without saying anything. Ray looked at it. He read enough of it to know what it was. He set it down and didn't say anything for a while. Then he looked directly at the narrator. The old warmth came back in his face, practiced and immediate like a reflex. "Tom," he said, "come on. 8 years. Can we step out for 10 minutes and figure this out like we always have? Just us." The narrator looked at him. "For 8 years, I let you handle the boring stuff," he said. "Turns out the boring stuff was the whole business." Ray opened his mouth. "I'll sign whatever Susan puts in front of me," the narrator said. "And I won't sit across a table from you again." Ray closed his mouth. Susan laid out the 3 options with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and had no interest in drawing it out. Ray buys the narrator's share at forensic adjusted valuation. The narrator buys Ray out at a number that accounts for the missing funds plus interest. Or they go to court, at which point the shell vendor documentation, Linda's statement, and 6 years of adjusted journal entries become part of a public filing. Ray asked for a week to consider. Susan told him he had 48 hours. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and left without saying anything else. The door didn't slam. It closed quietly, which was almost worse. Ray signed on a Tuesday morning. The narrator arrived at Susan's office at 9, and Ray was already there, seated across from his own attorney, the documents in front of him. He didn't make conversation. He read each page with the focused attention of a man who had apparently been capable of reading documents carefully the entire time, signed where he was directed, and stood up when it was done. He picked up his copy of the agreement and walked out of the office and didn't look over the narrator once. The terms were structured over 3 years. The buyout number was lower than the business's clean valuation would have produced, adjusted to reflect what the forensic accounting had documented, with a lien on Ray's personal assets securing the payment schedule. It wasn't everything. It was what was recoverable without a court filing that would have cost more in legal fees and time than the difference was worth. Susan had been direct about that math, and the narrator had accepted it. He drove to the shop afterward and went back to work. The crew found out the following week. Not the details, just the shape of it. Ray was gone, the narrator was sole owner, and the partnership had been dissolved. He told them to break room on a Monday morning, kept it brief, said the business was stable and the work calendar was full and nothing was changing on the floor. Two of the senior guys caught him privately before the day was out. Davis had been on the floor since year 2 and Hector since year 4, and they came to him together, which felt deliberate. "We never said anything," Davis said, "but we wondered. The watch thing a few years back. We talked about it between us." Hector nodded. "I almost quit last year," he said. "There was something I couldn't put my finger on. Just a feeling that something wasn't adding up." The narrator asked him why he stayed. "Because the work is good," Hector said, "and because you're straight with us." He thanked them and didn't say anything else about it. He wasn't sure what else there was to say. Linda came back the following Monday. Part-time, same days as before, but at a higher rate with a new title and a direct reporting line to the narrator with no intermediary. She came in that first morning with her usual composure and a banker's box under one arm. She set it on his desk and took off her coat. "Copies," she said. "I kept them when I was putting together the folder for you. I wasn't sure what would be needed." He looked at the box. 2 years of careful documentation, kept quietly at her own house, by a woman who had seen something wrong and hadn't been able to stop it, but had refused to let it disappear entirely. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and went to her desk and started her morning the way she always did. He sat with the box for a moment and then opened his laptop and started his. The floor ran the same as it always had. The work went out clean. The client list held. But every invoice that came across his desk now, he read himself, and every vendor name he recognized because he'd put it there, and every distribution figure he calculated from numbers he had personally reviewed. It was more work than he'd expected, and he didn't mind that at all. It was a Sunday again. Same back office, same desk, same laptop. A year out from the dissolution, and I was closing out the month the way I did every month now, working through the vendor ledger line by line, reconciling against the bank statement, making sure everything I saw on the screen matched something real in the world. It took a few hours. I didn't mind a few hours. The numbers were smaller than they'd been under Ray. That had been a hard adjustment for about 2 months, and then it stopped being hard because the numbers were real. Every figure on that screen was something I could account for, traced back to a decision I'd made or a cost I'd approved, and there was a steadiness in that I hadn't expected. I'd spent 8 years looking at totals that felt uncertain in a way I couldn't articulate. Now I knew why they'd felt that way, and I knew why they didn't anymore. Carol was at the other desk. She'd taken over as CFO 6 months after the dissolution, which had not been the plan when any of this started, but had turned out to be the most clarifying decision I'd made in the aftermath. She understood the books as well as I did now, and better in some respects, and she had no patience for anything that didn't add up, which was exactly what the business needed. Davis and Hector were on a profit-share model I'd designed myself, built around the floor revenue they directly influenced. Linda's sign statement was in a locked drawer in the filing cabinet. I hadn't needed to open that drawer in months. I heard through mutual contact that Ray had tried to start something new in another state. Got some initial interest, maybe some early clients, and then the story caught up with him the way stories do in industries where people talk. It hadn't gotten off the ground. The contact mentioned it the way you mention weather, not expecting much of a reaction. I didn't feel satisfied when I heard it. I didn't feel vindicated or relieved or any of the things I might have expected to feel. I just noted it and moved on, the same way I'd moved on for most of it by then. The handshake in the parking lot 8 years ago wasn't the mistake. I used to think it was in the early months after the dissolution, when I was going back through everything looking for the moment I could have chosen differently. But the handshake was just the beginning, and the beginning was fine. The mistake was every time I looked at a number that didn't feel right and let Ray explain it away. Every tax return I signed without reading. Every year, I told myself the money side wasn't my job because I decided that once in a parking lot and never revisited the decision. I chose not to look because looking felt like not trusting, and I'd confused those two things for 8 years. I trust Carol. I trust Davis and Hector. I trust Linda, who kept copies of documents in her own house on the chance that someone might eventually need them. And I trust myself to close out the books on the last Sunday of every month for the rest of my working life, because that's not a burden anymore. That's just what it means to actually run the thing you built. I'm over at where silence ends. If you ever handed someone the keys to something important because it felt like trust and found out later it was just easier than looking, drop it in the comments.